Robert Kaufman has been a household name at Berkeley since, and I'm not sure about that date, 1976, when he enrolled as an undergraduate. Consequently, he holds a bachelor's degree and a PhD in English from Berkeley. However, and this could certainly figure as a most unusual accomplishment, he also went to law school and practiced labor and employment discrimination law for several years, before he would eventually return to academia, where he has held several prestigious positions at McGill University in Montreal, at the University of Chicago, and in Stanford University, where he was assistant professor of English and affiliated assistant professor of German studies and of modern thought and literature. Eventually, he would return to Berkeley in July 2007, joining the comparative literature faculty. Quite in keeping with his academic biography, Robert Kaufman's research has been dedicated to Frankfurt School critical theory. And obviously, I met Robert Kaufman first in Frankfurt on Main at the now famous Festival Kongress Lyrik in 2019, where he was, I believe, the only participant from the United States. His research interest, however, has by no means been limited to contemporary poetry. Bertolt Brecht, Paul Celan, Walter Benjamin, or the Frankfurt School. He has extensively taught and published on Kant, Keats, Shelley, and Romanticism. Moreover, he has enhanced academic knowledge on music, cinema, and painting. Last but not least, he has specialized on César Vallejo, probably one of the most underestimated poets in world literature. And Vallejo will also be focus of today's lecture on what was commitment, engagement, compromiso, critical aesthetic autonomy in César Vallejo, Marx, and the Frankfurt School. Robert Kaufman, thank you very much indeed for being here and giving your lecture. The screen is yours now.
Thank you so much, Matthias, and thank you for your generosity in extending the invitation. Also, thanks more than I can possibly say to Anna for all the work she's done, and to you, Henrika, as well. I really appreciate the chance to speak today. I want to say at the start that all the things that I'll say that will no doubt be somewhere between questionable and wrong are due to me and me alone. But there's a great deal that over the years, I've been very, very lucky to have benefited from some of the people who are here today and a couple who aren't, that I'll just briefly mention. For years, even before I met him, I learned so much from Jonathan Culler and have been able, since coming to know him, to be in dialogue with him, conversation, and sometimes debate about converging and sometimes diverging ideas about the history and workings of lyric poetry and related arts, but it's always been a conversation from which at every point it makes me think and understand more. It's been more recent, but I've also been incredibly fortunate to be in dialogue with Christian Metz, who is an astonishing source of poetry internationally. And although he's not here now, Victor Quiroz, from Peru, who is at Berkeley and with whom I've taught Vallejo together, has been also just an amazing presence, as my colleague, the Latin Americanist Francine Maziello. And above all, the poet and translator Norma Cole is someone whom incessantly for decades now I've had the opportunity to talk about Vallejo in relation to all the other poets that have come our way and that we've been lucky to think about, read, and think about more together. I've been so impressed with the talks in the Trier series that I've been able to attend, and I've been especially impressed at the ability of the various speakers to present papers. Unfortunately, every time I've tried to present a paper on Zoom, it's been clear to me that I should be hired by medical staffs treating people who have trouble falling asleep, because I seem to have a talent, especially on Zoom. When I read a prepared paper, it takes about 3.5 minutes and everyone is extraordinarily relaxed, meaning their eyes are closed and mine is as well. I've learned that as a result, that however awkward it may be with pauses, it's probably somewhat better for me to just talk a little bit more informally, as if we're all in a conversation. So that's what I'll do. I'll be focusing really only on 2 poems, mentioning some other texts, both of poetry, philosophy, and critical theory, by Vallejo and by other poets, a little bit by Marx, and just a mention or 2 of figures from the Frankfurt School. But after Matthias had mentioned a few things about Vallejo, and Christian and I had talked about his reception in Germany, I thought that not to overload you with any idea that you would need to read it now or ever, I would nonetheless give various related texts that might be of interest later on to people, and that I would try to make them available in the original Spanish, and for obvious reasons, not only in English translation, which is my native tongue, but in German as well. Not all of them were texts that I had at hand in German translation, but some of them have been. Anna is only going to put up a little bit later in the talk the Spanish original English translation, because I feared that if I also read the German translation of the 2 poems and went back and forth to them, I'd be spending most of the time just reading, which actually might be a wise thing to do, but I'm going to talk a little bit more than read. But I did want you to have them at hand. Years ago, I started thinking about the first of
What has happened to the connection? The screen seems to have been frozen and there is no sound.
Maybe, Matthias, you can write him in the chat that he can try to join us again.
Yeah.
Reloading. It resolves the issue.
Oh, I think it works. Yes. No need to send off my message right now. He's done it. Marvelous.
He only must turn on the sound, which is yes now.
Thank you. My apologies. Sorry, lost the connection. These are the theses on Feuerbach that Marx wrote when he was in his early 20s, a text that he never tried to publish and that Engels found after Marx's 1883 death in a notebook. And they were published and were immediately important, but it really wasn't until Lenin around 1910, in the years just before the First World War, between 1910 and 1914, Lenin above all was the key figure in pushing the idea that the theses on Feuerbach were something like a theory of the unity of theory and practice, or the commitment of the intellectual, and by extension as well, the artist. Marx refers in these theses to the need to unite intellectual activity, or to think about the unity of one's philosophical or theoretical or intellectual work with their political and presumably ethical activity as well. But it's in a very intense way, starting really with Lenin, that there's the notion that the unity needs to be extremely intense. And the way I just put it was, it's presented as a theory of the unity of theory and practice. around the time I was beginning some years ago to reconsider whether that was really what Marx meant at all, I also began reading the first, quite a lot of Vallejo. I had been reading him before, but came across a poem not that often discussed. It's untitled, but goes therefore by the title of its first line, En el momento en que el tenista, at the moment the tennis player. And it was an interesting experience in understanding the poem and understanding, I thought, or I began to think, Marx and what Marx was after in the thesis on Feuerbach in a very different way. And it wasn't because Vallejo got there at the start. He began as a critic and writer, and really in public didn't much change his mind publicly. Once he got involved with Marxism in his exile from Peru in Paris, starting in 1923 until his death there in 1938, he never returned to Peru and split his time between France, Spain, a few other countries in Europe, and the Soviet Union, but he was mostly based in France, and the other country in which he spent the most time was Spain. But Vallejo had a more or less orthodox understanding that via Marxism-Leninism, as a critic and commentator and journalist, at least that was the position he usually seemed to put forward, that the theses on Feuerbach, and especially the most famous, the 11th one, the English translation of it is, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And that the meaning of that was that all attempts to only interpret the world, to only be philosophical, and to not at every point have one's philosophy or theory or criticism, or for that matter, one's art aligned with, or even better, united with presumably revolutionary philosophical principles and theory, which really presumably meant Marxism-Leninism, then the work wasn't really committed. It didn't really rank as being motivated in the better or best or even acceptable ways. This is probably familiar to many of you. My apologies if it seems like old hat. Vallejo 3 times set about trying to do something like a poesis of Thesis 11 and really of all the theses on Feuerbach. And the first attempt was a journalistic piece that staged something like a contemporary, meaning 1920s Paris, 1920s Western Europe, debate or dialogue, a kind of Platonic dialogue between a priest and a tennis player. The second attempt was a prose poem, and the third attempt at it was the poem that you have in front of you in verse, En el momento, the moment the tennis player. Each one has materials that appear in each of these versions, but the more we move from newspaper article cast as philosophical dialogue or vice versa, and then to the prose poem, whose title was From Feuerbach to Marx, de Feuerbach a Marx, and then the final poem, which is untitled. In each case, we move to more and more ambiguity about what the poem does, and by extension, or maybe even prior to any extension, the materials themselves of what's in Marx. And so here's very briefly what I mean about that other view of Marx, which is something like, at least since Rosa Luxemburg, has always been present as a kind of, one might call it a minoritarian reading of the theses on Feuerbach. It's almost as explicit as I'm about to make it in Horkheimer and especially Adorno. on and off with Marcuse, especially in Marcuse's last years, when he seems to return to more of a position for a few years that's closer to Adorno on political motivation, but the critical autonomy of the artwork, not autonomy from material conditions, which all of them in this minoritarian view think is absurd, but autonomy from already determined concepts. Reading the Vallejo poem that I'll be discussing in a moment helped me see and then reread with fresh eyes the history of Marx and Engels' involvement with the young Hegelians, in which it was taken for granted that philosophical activity could and should try to make itself into a revolutionary act. The Vallejo poem helped me see, I think I might have gotten there anyway, but not in any sense as intensely, that Marx is actually pace or contra Lenin and contra what might be called, including till today, on various fronts of the left that are by no means necessarily thinking of themselves as Leninist or vanguardist, that Marx in thesis 11, the final of the thesis on Feuerbach, is rather than saying to himself, we need a philosophy, that is a theory, in which interpretation is already political activity, is actually in the context of, at that point, the most radical, and not by accident in his eyes, philosopher of the critique of religious institutions, Feuerbach. It's actually an attempt to say that the search, very much including on the left, for a theory that in adopting it, in holding it, already could count as action in the world, is actually very often likely a misguided reconstruction without the realization of it, without understanding of one of the only two activities Marx thinks in human life where it is coherent, not necessarily correct, but coherent to say that a thought itself in a generalizable way, potentially universalizable way, could count as action. That doesn't mean Marx believes that's correct, but it's coherent to believe it, to think it, to say it. And that's religion, because the deity in the religions Feuerbach and Marx are thinking of is understood as seeing your belief in the deity, let's say God, let's say a monotheistic God, in which case the mere thought, the belief action, the action of thinking, always, already, and in every case counts as action, indisputably, to the believer. Marx obviously cannot share that belief, but he thinks it's coherent. But in looking for, although he doesn't use the word, a secular sense of what would count as philosophical critical analysis, and he thinks continuing but moving more radically forward from Feuerbach's critique of religion and religious institutions, Marx, in what becomes the minoritarian reading and is almost explicit in Adorno by the late 1930s and then on through the late 1960s, is that Marx is actually in thesis 11 and building up to it all through the thesis on Feuerbach, pushing towards the idea that philosophy and all forms of intellectual thought are potentially extremely valuable, and that the search for a kind of thinking which is already action is beside the point, and that what one wants to do is take in as much that might be valuable in all sorts of intellectual resources and stop mistaking philosophy for political practice, which by no means is to say, stop reading philosophy, stop thinking philosophically. It's to say one continues to do it, but doesn't look to philosophy as the act that changes the world or even a theory of how to change the world. Rather, it's a source of invaluable, priceless sets of intellectual tools that one wants to keep returning to. That's sort of the philosophical and critical step that I think is actually fairly easy to get to without Vallejo, because it's there in the history of Marx breaking with the young Hegelians. But there's actually also one more coherent form, at least, but I think in Marx's eyes, there's basically two coherent forms of having the notion deeply that one's thought already is action or has already done something. And that's the aesthetic. And that's, for Marx, really because he's clear about this in some of the essays he's writing just before he writes the thesis on Feuerbach, especially entfremdete Arbeit, especially estranged labor or estranged work. He's quite clear that he thinks of mimesis and beauty not as a copying, but as a relational activity that presumes difference, or there wouldn't be the need to think of how to construct the relation. And the feeling, I've got it, we've got it, there's the relation, which is another way of saying, I've got the Begriff, meaning everyone could share in it. That is not a lie, but it is shine. It is an illusion because everyone doesn't yet have it. It's not an established concept yet. The difference for Marx is hardly alone in this. This is obviously at least a Kantian and arguably an Aristotelian position on the critical value of mimesis or art or aesthetic experience. But what that does is change thesis 11 and also understand its incredible energy. And I would push it further and say its very form as not only aphoristic, but probably the larger category that literary historians tend to think aphorism breaks away from and is initially part of, which is essentially, until modernism at least, our shortest form of or subgenre of lyric poetry, the epigram. And epigrammatic experience or lyric experience or aesthetic experience makes one feel that what has just happened internally, so to speak, feels like something has happened in the world. And the paradox of thesis 11 is that it has always, once Engels published it, to the point where in the DDR, in East Germany, in the GDR, thesis 11 was very frequently put onto the doorways and the hallways of institutions of learning. Understandably so, and it was felt to be inspiring and not often said so, but it was actually treated as itself, the way Marx would have put it, as an aesthetic object or as an aesthetic object that activates people. The difference from the religious sense, and this is where I think Marx is quite proto-Adornian, the difference there is that presumably the epigram or any other artwork, after inspiring one to feel, I can think this, which is not authorized by any previous concept I've had. It's not necessarily antagonistic to them, but it's not determined by already existing concepts. That sense of agency, of energization, of activation is crucial to being an ethical or political or thinking agent. The difference for Marx, at any rate, from religious belief, where it feels like this is now true, is that the artwork then looks back at us and says, it's crucial that you have this feeling, but it hasn't been legitimated in the world. Any legitimation of what you think is the extra truth that you seem to have hit the mark of, that you seem to have accessed, is going to be legitimated in an extra post-aesthetic debate or fight or dialogue or contest or all of the above with other people who you'll now need to survey or find out or be in dialogue with about whether they really do see it that way as well as you had. That's an overly long and yet still not even close to long enough attempt to explain what I think, at least since Rosa Luxemburg, has been implicitly the notion that Marx is actually writing something that becomes so powerful in thesis 11, precisely because it's playing with what it thinks philosophy or critical theory shouldn't do unless it moves into territory that is potentially, I don't mean this as malevolent, but dishonest. Making claims and wanting those claims to be taken without any real evidence for them, like a religious belief, or, but somewhat differently, like a work of art, but without the work of art's negative insistence. Wait a minute, the activation, the sensing of capacity, of agency that you just had was crucial and good, but you also now need to discount the feeling that something was already necessarily done to the world at large, that an action happened. An action probably didn't really happen. We all know exceptions where a work of art causes a strike, a protest, etc. For Marx, those are great, but they are very much the very minor exceptions and will be in the ongoing history of art. The real question is what the artwork can spark critically in thought, which then is the resource for more real action, activism, and then more critique of how the action or the political program or the activity could be made stronger, why it failed, why it wasn't more successful. So with all that, I think I'll now ask Anna to put up the first poem, and I'll first read it in two different English translations by the same translator. This is The Moment the Tennis Player. This first translation by Clayton Eshelman, who sadly passed away just about a year ago, and was in the United States and to a certain extent in other English-speaking countries, one of the most, if not himself, the most important source for translating really the most widespread editions of Vallejo that began to appear in 1968. A little bit before that in journals and magazines, but Clayton with Grove Press published the first edition of what were then known as the human poems, the Poemas Humanos, and then he proceeded to do more. This is his 1968 translation alone of the poem. The moment the tennis player magisterially serves his bullet, a totally animal innocence comes over him. The moment the philosopher surprises a new truth, he's a complete beast. Anatole France affirmed that the religious sentiment is the function of a special organ in the human body until now ignored. And one could say too then that the exact moment such an organ fully functions, the believer is so full of malice, one could almost call him a vegetable. Oh my soul, oh my thought, oh Marx, oh Feuerbach. 10 years later, Clayton, together with Jose Rubia Barcia, retranslates the poem. I'm sort of more partial to parts of the first translation, but he notices something fascinating, which is he had misread the Spanish as a 14-line sonnet, and that there had been some printing error and that it should have been a sonnet, or at least a 14-line poem that plays around sonnetness. And it's not. It's a 15-line poem in Spanish. And he changes the translation to 15 lines in this 1978 translation on the bottom. He also changes a prepositional phrase late in the poem to make the exact opposite point, which is in the first poem, the religious believer, according to Anatole France, or Vallejo's reading or extension of Anatole France, that the religious believer is, in the first translation, so filled with malice, tan puro de malicia, and in the second poem, the second translation, it's so devoid of malice, so clear of malice. This comes from an inherent ambiguity in the Spanish itself that is not in either the prose poem version, nor is it in, even more obviously, the philosophical dialogue. Vallejo changes this, and it mostly probably in Spanish would be read as clear, absent of malice, but there's no way you can read the prepositional phrase, and it's not what we call Peruanismo, a Peruvianism. Among the people that I've interviewed about this from Peru or in Peru, or someone in the audience today, Ron Goloy, who is one of the other people who, if I recall, has assured me this prepositional phrase isn't a particularly Peruvian one. It's something Vallejo is playing with, and I'll talk about why in a moment. But this second translation reads, the moment the tennis player masterfully serves his bullet, a totally animal innocence possesses him. The moment the philosopher surprises a new truth, he's an absolute beast. Anatole France, the French writer, philosopher who won the Nobel Prize early in the 20th century for literature, Anatole France affirmed that religious feeling is the function of a special organ in the human body, until now unrecognized. And one could also say then that the exact moment when such an organ fully functions, the believer is so clear of malice, he could almost be considered a vegetable. O soul, O thought, O Marx, O Feuerbach, also taking out the possessive that Clayton had added the first time. Here's the original, and whether you know Spanish or not, it's purposefully, I think, in rather simple, a rather simple lexicon, and I think you'll hear the prosody very tellingly. En el momento en que el tenista lanza magistralmente su ala, le posee una inocencia totalmente animal. En el momento en que el filósofo sorprende una nueva verdad, es una bestia completa. Anatole France afirmaba que el sentimiento religioso es la función de un órgano especial del cuerpo humano, hasta ahora ignorado, y se podría decir también entonces que en el momento exacto en que un tal órgano funciona plenamente, tan puro de malicia está el creyente que se diría casi un vegetal. O alma, o pensamiento, Marx o Feuerbach. Forgive me for throwing everything in a reading of the poem at you at once. I'm conscious of the time and how much longer it always takes to say everything than one thinks it will. And I very much want to get to the second poem. So what I'll do, and I'll be happy to talk more in discussion about the particulars of this. Vallejo's poem, this one, it's not one of his most famous, although it's fairly well known, but there's not an extended deep body of commentary on it. It's referred to briefly by a number of critics, not that many other poet critics, as something like an illustration of a materialist, partly Leninist reading, maybe more than partly, of Marx as a determinist and of Feuerbach himself already as a materialist determinist. I'll just say that this poem is an astonishing, for me, tour de force of playing with sonnet form in the process of exploding it, of trying to do what Benjamin Adorno would call understanding art, understanding literature especially, and above all, the lyric poem as the source for the theory of constellation as what Marx and Engels were thinking of with historical materialism, rather than an economic determinism or any other historical determinism. And what I mean by that is Vallejo takes what at the moment that he writes the poem, and before it and afterwards as well, tennis is popularly thought of, not exclusively, but mostly as an upper class sport. Vallejo rather outrageously just thinks of the tennis players' animal instincts and compares them immediately, as you can see, to something like what would be perhaps the stereotype of a Feuerbachian materialist philosopher becoming overtaken by material instinct. And Vallejo drafts Anatole France, who actually, in his own critiques of religion and his fights with the especially French Catholic Church early in the 20th century, made a number of very witty bon mots of this type about, it's just been discovered allegedly by a number of scientists that right near the liver is another organ from which all religious sentiment comes. Interestingly, a number of the readings of the poem by critics very much take Vallejo to be only slightly exaggerating his own point of view that everything is materialist and material. Among the things that ignores is the status of the artwork we're looking at, which is that it's a poem that is an extraordinary tennis game of thought and feeling together, and of the interpenetration of the two, and in fact, a constellation of the entire, I'm perhaps exaggerating a little, but much of the history, let's put it that way, of the sonnet form and its reception in Spanish in particular, constellated together with the reading and the moment the poem is written, when the whole world, Brecht is writing at that moment, Die Maßnahme, with its own attempt to think very infamously of a certain very problematic different reading of Thesis 11 that is commented on at length by figures from Hannah Arendt to Adorno, but first of all by the Soviet Communist Party, which immediately tells Brecht to never again allow that play to be performed or published because it's so damaging for the image of Marxism-Leninism, which is what Arendt says is actually the brilliance, unintentionally, of Brecht. It's a very different reading than the one Vallejo gives here. And to get very short about it, Vallejo, in bringing in Anatole France, who really did say words to this effect, he's also inevitably, Anatole France was the pen name for the writer who became Anatole France and famous as Anatole France. But it allows him to bring in the word France, the country where Vallejo is living. For Vallejo, like Marx, the bastion, or at least the progenitor of modern revolution itself, with the prise de la Bastille, but not least the moment a month before the prise de la Bastille, which is the tennis court oath, which is what Vallejo is also in a somewhat comic but also serious way bringing back. The poem ends with this extraordinary series of 4 apostrophes. And I feel a little silly speaking about apostrophe, at least in the Zoom presence of one of our most important commentators, Jonathan Culler, on apostrophe. But I'll just say, in honor of what I've learned from Jonathan and possibly egregiously in my own additions to it, Vallejo is thinking of apostrophe as something that gives us the notion that at a certain point it becomes absurd to separate the material or the sensation experience from thought, and that art itself is the kind of sine qua non where that is not only absurd in general to insist that there could be only one or the other, but there really is no art without the constant interfusion, and far from a happy medium, an ongoing tennis game. What you get in the poem finally, I wish I had more time to say this, but I do want to move on to the other poem, is an explosion in the 15th line of sonnet form by pushing it into what has probably felt to most readers in Spanish like it's some sonnet, clearly with a rhyme scheme, but perhaps not, and probably not a strict one. And so there's something exploratory going on. The exploration turns out to be a preservation, you might say, by cancellation of the sonnet form. It's still there, but it's the poem itself reaches beyond it. One of the jokes of the poem is that the 4 apostrophes are something like 4 unanswered serves, or at least 4 unanswered points in a tennis game. 15-0, 0, 30-0, 45-0, final point game. The difference between a sport and art, and in this case especially poetry, is that the service, instead of being a win, is taken in by the addressee, who is also, as many theories of lyric and practices of lyric have always said, the reader needs to become the speaker, the participant in the poem, to make themselves experience it, and in that sense recite it, even if not literally aloud, but internally so. All that is being played with, and that O is the opening and is also hearkening back historically to the tennis court oath itself, which is to say the beginnings of the third estate reconstituting itself in an O, an oath. They don't use the word oath in English with its O, but nonetheless, opening the mouth, opening the lungs and the organ of speech to air and to shared public space. That tennis court oath in Versailles is suddenly transformed from a royal private scene to the beginning of, or one of the beginnings of what we think of as a modern public sphere. It gets really good when one gets into the metrics in Spanish. Vallejo is also simultaneously playing with the endecasílabo, the 11-syllable line inherited from Italian poetry in Spanish, contrasting it with his most important predecessor, Rubén Darío, who had developed the sonnet into the possibility of a 14-syllable line. Some of the lines are obviously much shorter in syllabic count, so that you have this constant, almost tennis game juggling with all of them. And he keeps in miniature, including in the final possible syllable count of O Feuerbach, repeating the number of syllables, which would be 4, by which one would be in excess of the count 11, that is the usual sonnet line, to get to 15, which is also to get to a 15th line of a kind of new sonnet or post-sonnet. In one of the possible readings of the metrics of the poem, the X of Marx falls on what would be the end of the 11th syllable. In essence, a continuation with Marx, past Marx, ironically, to a reopening of Feuerbach, which was presumably what Marx had intended. My apologies for running through this as if it's a tennis game. I'll ask Anna to put up the second poem. Un hombre pasa con un pan al hombro. And I'll read it first in an English translation that is my emendation of the one published by Clayton Eshelman. And I want to say that the Vallejo poem we just read, the tennis player poem, we don't have a precise date for it. It was never published in Vallejo's lifetime. His widow, Georgette de Vallejo, published it the year following his untimely death from a mysterious virus in 1938, soon after a trip when he had visited the Spanish Republic in what was to be, unfortunately, the last year of its life before fully overthrown by Franco. He died in March of 1938 in Paris, and the following year, a large body of his poetry that had not yet been published. He'd had 2 books published in Peru before he arrived in Paris. The largest body of his work began to be published almost only posthumously. Both these poems were published posthumously, but this second poem was written only months before his death. And it took me years after thinking through and playing around with the tennis player poem to seeing that this second poem that we're about to look at, also untitled, known as Un hombre pasa, a man goes by, or a man walks by, or a man happens by, or a man passes. All of those readings are possible. To see that this second poem was a less theoretical, but more, you might say, next step realized, not better, but next step, a more practical grappling on Vallejo's part with thesis 11 again. And I won't take the time now to go into it, but it turns out that the purest 11 syllable count in Spanish, which would not rely on very legitimate tricks that any tricks is a loaded word, very legitimate ways of playing that poets always have when they're working and want to work in metric schemes with combining syllables, liaison, other things. One of the key terms in Spanish is the sin alefa, which allows you to count in certain cases as 1 or 2 syllables, what otherwise might sound like 5, because of certain ways that the vowels are concatenated, or deciding that you want to exit from those rules and play around. The first and final lines, they may not be the only, the first and final couplets both begin with lines in Spanish where it's not necessary to do that. I don't think this is 100% certain, but my gut has told me over the last year that this is partly because Vallejo is, again, very much thinking about thesis 11. I'm going to shut up for the moment, as anyone really engaging a poem should do much more than I am with the commentary and get to the poem. Here's the English, and then I'll turn to the original. A man passes by with a bread on the shoulder. I'm going to write after that on my double. Another sits, scratches, extracts a louse from his armpit, kills it. With what nerve to speak of psychoanalysis? Another's entered my chest with a stick in his hand. To talk afterwards of Socrates to the physician? A lamed man goes by, arm upheld by a child. After that, I'm going to go read André Breton. Another trembles from cold, coughs, spits blood. Ever befitting to allude to the deep inner self? Another searches in muck for bones, for rhymes. How to write after that of the infinite? A builder falls from a roof, dies, now doesn't eat lunch. To innovate then the trope, the metaphor? A merchant cheats a customer out of a gram. To speak then of the fourth dimension? A banker falsifies his balance. With what face to weep in the theater? A pariah sleeps with foot behind his back. to speak after that to anyone of Picasso? Somebody goes to a burial sobbing. How, after that, become member of the Academy? Somebody cleans a rifle in the kitchen. With what nerve to speak of the beyond? Somebody passes, counting with his fingers. How to speak of the not I without raising a cry? For those of you whose native tongue is German, I've put a German translation I'm very fond of, the one that Hans Magnus Enzensberger made in 1963 in a selection, a really wonderful selection he did of Vallejo. And I think that Anna will have it in the chat. You may have already gotten it as an attachment. This is the poem. You can tell it's all in couplets. Versos pareados, we say in Spanish. Un hombre pasa con un pan al hombro. Voy a escribir después, sobre me doble. Otro se sienta, ráscase, extrae un piojo de su axila, mátalo. ¿Con qué valor hablar del psicoanálisis? Otro ha entrado en mi pecho con un palo en la mano. Hablar luego de Sócrates al médico. Un cojo pasa dando el brazo a un niño. Voy después a leer a André Breton. Otro tiembla de frío, tose, escupe sangre. Cabral oír jamás al yo profundo. Otro busca en el fango huesos, cáscaras. ¿Cómo escribir después del infinito? Un albañil cae de un techo, muere y ya no almuerza. Innovar luego el tropo, la metáfora. Un comerciante roba un gramo en el peso a un cliente. Hablar después de cuarta dimensión. Un banquero falsea su balance. ¿Con qué cara llorar en el teatro? Un paria duerme con el pie a la espalda. Hablar después a nadie de Picasso. Alguien va en un entierro sollozando. ¿Cómo luego ingresar a la academia? Alguien limpia un fusil en su cocina. ¿Con qué valor hablar de más allá? Alguien pasa contando con sus dedos. ¿Cómo hablar de no yo sin dar un grito? Most of the important, by that I mean influential. In fact, I would go so far as to say almost all the influential readings and commentaries on this poem, for very good reason, by critics, professional academic critics, more public sphere critics, and by poets commenting on the poem, have very rightly focused on this as something like an extraordinary poem of extraordinary momentum, of almost self-laceration or flagellation. With such suffering in the world, poems written in November 1937, it could have been written earlier, but it happens to have been written then. And in Spanish, it actually has the date on the bottom of the poem, shown, included in the poetic text. How can I possibly be an intellectual, interested in philosophy, above all, obviously, a poet? And this is allowing for a difference, but probably a clear relation between the poem's speaker, who is not necessarily César Vallejo, but if he's not, he certainly is, as Grace Paley would say, he certainly works for the poet. And Vallejo writes a lot of poems like this, as do a lot of poets writing in the first person I. Others writing in the I or without it don't do this. But Vallejo writes quite a number of poems where the name César Vallejo is in the poem. And it clearly invites us to both see that biographical, let alone other historical materials, but the biographical materials are in the poem, but that the César Vallejo in the poem may not be exactly, and probably is not exactly, the César Vallejo of life and history itself. I think all of those interpretations are exactly right, that this poem is asking, how can one do this? But they all also point to an almost unaccountable energy the poem has, and they tend to leave it there. And in a certain way, I think that's also very, very justified. And one can imagine Vallejo imagined people would, at least in commentary and in discussion of it, often leave it there, but that they would also be aware that there was some extraordinary energy happening to them. And in a way that I'll add would perhaps seem unaccountable, and certainly most of the commentary does not account for this. And I think this is something I only began to put into words for myself, as I've said, about a year ago, and to begin to see this as a companion poem to En el momento en que el tenista. And that is the poem's undercurrent. I don't think it's deeply hidden. It's not in neon, but neither is it hidden. The poem itself, at every moment from its second line, is indicating that one must write and read and engage with poetry, and that the poem is at every moment, so to speak, acting out what its questions seem to say is almost outrageous to do. And its temporal structure quite explicitly is, I'm going to write after that about this, I'm going to think or talk after. In every couplet, or almost every couplet, that's literally exactly what is happening or has just happened. The poem or the poet has just written, or the speaker has just said what the question rhetorically seems to say, you can't possibly do that. Not only can you do it, it's being done or already is done by the time the line is finished. More importantly, not more importantly, but following from that, and I'll try to conclude this as briefly as I can, the poem from start to finish is, in a way that I think its feeling, energy, and rhythm indicate from the get-go, the poem is not only an argument with its own subject speaker or speakers, it's an argument for that minoritarian reading of Thesis 11, that the experience a poem or other artwork, in this case it clearly is a poem, can provide is absolutely indispensable to the questioning. Every single second line of this couplet ends with a question mark. And in a way that's sort of pre-given just because of the way the Spanish language and its punctuation develops. There's the happy accident that in Spanish, we have a double question mark. So the form Vallejo chooses, which is the couplet, verso pareado, itself also has this doubleness. I don't want to give in to the impulse to talk about this for the 6 hours I could, but Vallejo has done what recently, without talking about Vallejo or having Vallejo in mind, the former American poet laureate Robert Hass, in a wonderful book he published a couple of years ago called A Little Book on Form, suggesting that when we think of verses and lines in poetry, although one can think of the one-line poem, of course, as a form, and of course it is, it might be more accurate to think of it as a gesture, and poetic form itself beginning with the couplet, with a two-line poem, which is not necessarily a couplet, but the history often, for obvious reason, makes us want to think of it. And as you'll see, Vallejo has set the whole poem up. There are 13 couplets. Vallejo, as you saw in the last poem, is fascinated with numerical explorations that he doesn't necessarily want us to focus on immediately in a very intellectual way, but that he trusts will feel that there's a doubling of almost sonnet length. If these were single lines, it would be 13. almost the line length of a sonnet. That doesn't mean even if there were 14, it would be a sonnet, but you would be attuned to that possibility. Vallejo starts talking about his doble, his double, at the very end of the first couplet. And it's another version for him of mimesis as relation and difference. It's a question, sobre mi doble. In Spanish, sobre means on top of, about. I'm going to be on top of my double. He's also got from the start the almost doubling of the Spanish word for man and shoulder. One single vowel separates the two. This is something in other poems that I haven't given you. Vallejo loves this play, this almostness. Obviously, many, many poets do. The almost doubling, he's also playing around from the first line on with a kind of politically concerned about suffering, for him Marxian, it doesn't need to be Marxian, sense of an inheriting of Matthew 4, I can't remember, it's 4:6 or 4:10, 4:10 or 4:6. It's man does not live by bread alone. What are the consequences? Jesus says to Satan, who's just tempted him with producing bread from everywhere to entice the masses to follow him. Jesus doesn't just say man does not live by bread alone. Jesus, who famously doesn't write a word himself, says, está escrito. Sorry, I'm quoting the Bible in Spanish. It is written, man does not live by bread alone, quoting the Old Testament. Vallejo, all through the poem, is playing with that, and his various figures of suffering are notably filled with what Marx called at certain points the Lumpenproletariat. At certain points, the class designation of the figure is utterly unclear. Who is in the theater? Who has just gone to a burial? The class of the person isn't given. The place where it's absolutely clear for the only time is right in the middle of the poem, the start of the 13th line, the middle couplet, where it's un albañil, which in Spanish is either bricklayer or construction worker or builder. There are other possible renderings, but usually bricklayer as the foundation of all construction, laying the foundation. I would love to go on, but I'm just going to say two more things. Besides, it's impossible for me not to comment on, you'll notice them yourself, the rhymes that are quite startling that you only hear perhaps the second time through. If you have great ears, you may have heard them the first time through. With a little bit of delay, André Breton is being rhymed with cuarta dimensión, the fourth dimension. Picasso is being rhymed with teatro. The poem ends by asking, and your translation in the original of Clayton Eshelman's that I changed here, but this works as well. The final word in Enzensberger's translation is schreien, the infinitive for shouting or crying or shrieking. In Spanish, gritar would be the way to end if you were using the infinitive. Dar un grito could very well be translated as give a cry or raise a cry. In Spanish also, the grito, and arguably especially in Latin America since 1810, in waves of political rebellions and independence movements, the cry of independence or the moment of independence or the declaring of independence is called el grito de Dolores, el grito de Huaraca, el grito de Lares, el grito de Yarra. Vallejo is making the last word of the poem signify what poetry's questioning can do, which is still not itself an action on the ground, but is the raising of a question that might be on the road to a kind of independence, starting with an independence from determined concepts we already have. I changed in my translation in the very last couplet, what most translators in various languages translate again as the not self. Vallejo earlier in the poem has capitalized yo for self. In the final line of the poem in Spanish, the yo is not capitalized. No yo, without either the dash or the accent mark. N-O-Y-O in Spanish is the cognate for the French liqueur, aguardiente, noyo, which means kernel, which is because that liqueur is made, it makes one lose oneself, it's so strong, with the kernel of bitter almonds or bitter almond core. It's also a reference to a way to extend the Rimbaud idea of jouer un autre, which is already present at least since Rubén Darío, the 1880s approximately, in Latin American poetry, or a bit after, following Rimbaud. Vallejo is extending that and putting a weird and bizarre accent mark that goes up. Last word that risks admitting the craziness that my interpretation here or my engagement with it may indicate. I think the whole poem, without wanting us to get micro-fixated like investigators, I think the whole poem is thinking of the couplet as not the most privileged form in poetry or lyric poetry, but as an amazingly rich place because of the only two lines to be able to work out what art and poetry in particular, as our linguistic art moved or pushed towards musicality, can do with extending our ability to grasp more, at least within the experience of the work of art. And right in the middle of the poem is, for Vallejo, and he's channeling Marx and Fremdliche Arbeit here, for the only moment in the poem where he's clearly talking about a proletarian, the albañil, the construction worker, that's where it's clear that the second line is absolutely explicitly wanting the audience to understand the attempt to think of what it would mean to connect the work of the construction worker and the poet, or the one who engages with poetry. What would it, after that, I'll innovate the trope, the metaphor. Well, again, that's exactly what is going on. The final business here with the not I, no yo. In Spanish, no yo as a cognate for the French liqueur, N-O-Y-A-U, does not have a dash in it, nor an accent at the end. Vallejo adds these. He's adding two levers. I think he's thinking of the couplet as itself a lever, the whole poem as a lever to get underneath the material world in aesthetic experience, or at least to feel in Scheincharakter, in semblance experience, that poetry and the other arts give us a way that, as if we're not all completely already determined, to be able to see higher or wider or deeper than we otherwise could with only our existing concepts, including very valuable concepts, including, in Vallejo's case, Marxist concepts. And that last little dash and then accent mark, both of which are utterly unauthorized. Vallejo is making them both up. You cannot, what the O accent over the yo is, it's something like in Celan to make, there's a certain poem where Celan says, Ichten, to I oneself, to make oneself into an I. Vallejo is not only doing that here, but pushing on with Rimbaud, he's doing it and making the I into third person past tense, which is the only way in Spanish just about you would have an O with an accent mark over it. He's doing something in short, in micro, like making at the last minute or almost last minute of the poem, his own lever, his own palanca, we would say in Spanish, his own lever, which is what construction workers need to do to lift otherwise unliftable objects, the Archimedean action of thought. Give me a point, un punto, a point of view, and I can lift the world. I don't really think Vallejo is thinking of the poem as something like a treasure hunt. I think he's thinking of those graphic lines like the dash and the accent mark as a musical score that we either hear or see visually and feel. They're an indication, as a music score would be to the musicians, how to play something. Inevitably, there's a bit of a treasure hunt. There's much more to say, including about Picasso, but I'll stop there. Forgive me for going over time. Thank you for your patience, and my apologies again for all this being thrown out in one big kind of construction worker dropping all the materials at the bottom. Thank you for your patience.
Well, and thank you very much for your absolutely marvelous and stunning and incredibly inspiring lecture, which was not boring at all, but which has set, I believe, most of us off thinking wildly, in my case, that is. But if anybody has questions, please do not, as they say, hesitate to ask them.
And I would add, in a very, we would say, Vallejiano spirit, but much more than César Vallejo, denunciations are welcome as well. Critiques and repudiations of all kinds.
Say a big thank you to Robert Kaufman for his very, very inspiring lecture. And I really hate these clap hands, like Reaktionen, but I'll have to press the button now just to show some applause. Thank you.